The process. The sinner carries the sin and the sacrifice into the sanctuary. I showed you just now the sinner there in the bottom right of the picture, or the sinner bringing the sacrifice into the sanctuary. So the sinner carries both his sin and the sacrifice into the sanctuary. I think you'll agree with me, right? So there, watch the graphic now. There's the sinner at the bottom. He brings his sacrifice and his sin into the sanctuary. The sinner then transfers the sin to the sacrifice through confession, through the laying on of hands. The sin is transferred to the lamb, or to whatever sacrifice has been brought. The sin is now transferred. The sinner has transferred his sin to the lamb. Now what happens? Note that the sinner kills that sacrifice. Have a look. The sinner kills the lamb, and the high priest takes the offering and he puts it on the altar. So the sinner kills the lamb and literally takes the offering and puts it onto the altar. Then something happens. The high priest takes the blood into the holy place and he sprinkles the veil and the horns of the altar of incense. So he takes the blood of the lamb and he sprinkles the veil in the holy place. Number 5. The sin is then transferred into the sanctuary. There you can see the sin that came in through the door to the altar and then into the sanctuary. The sanctuary is now contaminated with sin. Does that make sense? Right? Now, this happened every single day. Here you have Israel at the bottom. And as sinners sinned, this continued every day. And the sinners brought in their sacrifice, and their sacrifices were placed on the altar and the blood put on the veil. This continued every day. And as you can see here, the sin heaped up and defiled the sanctuary. Every time a sinner brought in his sins, the sin was transferred into the sanctuary. I think you can see that, and that's clear. So what's happening to the sin? Or beg your pardon, what's happening to the death sentence? The death sentence is now transferred to somebody else, the lamb in this case, but the sin is itself, something else dies, but the sin is then taken and transferred into the sanctuary of God. Now, as you can see, the sanctuary must be restored or cleansed with those sins that are in the sanctuary. It cannot be defiled like this. This has to be cleansed. And that's where this anti-typical feast and the typical feast, the Day of Atonement, happened. Now, what is this Day of Atonement? Well, this was a very special day. The whole of Israel were removed from the sanctuary. The high priest worked alone in the sanctuary and went through a very specific ceremony called the cleansing of the sanctuary, the Day of Atonement. Right. Now, what happens here is, remember you had the 7 feasts and you got down to the second last feast, which was the Day of Atonement? Well, that's the type. In anti-type, we need to find out, how does this point to the Christian church, like crucifixion points to and the resurrection points to the Christian church. How does this work? Well, let's first find out what happened on the Day of Atonement. There you can see that interesting word, atonement. Look, on the Day of Atonement, the high priest would work alone in the sanctuary. The sins were in the sanctuary. The high priest would lay his hands on and slaughter a bullock for his own sins. So he would put his own sacrifice on the altar. Then he would take the blood and sprinkle the veil, just like the sins of the rest of Israel. He took his sins and placed them also at the veil. Now look, over here, he then changes his robes from the dark blue and the other colors to white robes, because he now stands there sinless and at one with God. Then he does something interesting. He brings 2 goats for the atonement offering. There's the first one, there's the second one. He then casts lots and kills one of the goats and places that goat's blood and the goat onto the sacrificial altar. Look what happens now. He now takes the blood of that goat into the most holy, and he sprinkles the blood on the mercy seat. Brothers and sisters, please notice the difference here between what happened every day. Every day, the priest was going in and out of the sanctuary, sprinkling the blood, in and out, sprinkling the blood, in and out, sprinkling the blood. But yet, once a year, the high priest would go into the most holy with a different mission. This was on the day of, what was that word? Atonement. Look what happens. He takes the blood from there and puts it into the most holy, but he sprinkles the blood literally on the mercy seat. The mercy seat is the lid of the Ark of the Covenant where the two angels are standing, right? Or kneeling at least. The Shekinah glory. So the high priest is literally in the presence of God, and the high priest drips the blood onto the mercy seat. Now what happens here is, once the atonement has been done for God's people in the most holy, the sin doesn't just disappear. The high priest then leaves the most holy, and he ceremonially transfers the sins in the sanctuary to this second goat called azazel, the scapegoat, through the laying on of hands. So watch what happens here now. The high priest leaves the most holy. He then ceremonially takes those sins and he transfers them onto the second goat, which was not killed, it was still alive. Right? Now look what happens. Leviticus 16 tells us, Aaron shall cast lots upon the two goats, one lot for the Lord and the other lot for the scapegoat. So there's two goats that come into the sanctuary. One, upon casting lots, one is slaughtered. His blood is taken into the most holy and sprinkled on the mercy seat. Then the second goat is called azazel, known as the scapegoat. That's where in English words the word comes from, the scapegoat, right? Because then the high priest leaves and he takes the sins in the holy place and he transfers them to the scapegoat. Question: why can the sins of Israel not be in the most holy? Because sin cannot be in the presence of God. Does it make sense? That's why the high priest first had to get cleansed and then go into the most holy. Now this gets exciting. What happens to the scapegoat? There's the word, Hebrew 5799, azazel. Actually, some people refer to azazel, right? I call it azazel. The goat, it's called literally in Hebrew, the goat of, interesting word this, the goat of departure, otherwise known as the scapegoat. Why would Hebrew call it the goat of departure? Look what happens. The sins have been transferred from the sanctuary to the scapegoat, and the scapegoat is then led far into the wilderness, never to return. A strong man would come in, fetch this goat, and this goat would be led out far into the wilderness, never to return. What do you notice about the sanctuary? Have a look. Can you see that the sanctuary is now restored and cleansed? There are no more sins in the sanctuary. And please notice that God is again at one with his people. That's why it's called the day of Atonement. You see that? The Day of Atonement was the day that God's people could again be at one with him. It was the day that everyone stood back. There was great celebration afterwards. The sins had been removed. Israel was again free. Until the first person sinned and had to start the whole process over again. And the high priest would take the sin into the sanctuary and onto the altar and into the sanctuary, and so it would continue. But brothers and sisters, once a year, the high priest would go in and cleanse the sanctuary, take the sins in the sanctuary, transfer them to the goat, azazel, and then that goat, the goat of departure, that goat would literally depart into the wilderness, never to return. Phenomenal how the business plan of salvation is laid out in such simplicity, the simplicity that is in Christ. But please note something absolutely critical. It is critical to note that there were two parts to the atonement process. One, sacrificial atonement was completed at the altar. That was with the sacrifice, the goat being put on the altar and the lambs being put on the altar. However, there it is. There's another part, which is a ceremonial atonement completed in the most holy. Can you see that? There's two separate sections, sacrificial atonement and ceremonial atonement. You cannot have just sacrificial atonement because the sins that caused the death sentence still have to be got rid of. Sin doesn't just disappear. Sin was transferred into the sanctuary, and the Lord has to make sure that it's dealt with correctly. So two parts. Please look, sacrificial atonement and ceremonial atonement. My question now, what has changed between the Old Testament and today? Well, Jesus said in Matthew 5 verse 17 that, think not that I am come to destroy the law of the prophets. I have not come to destroy, but to fulfill. I have not come to remove the systems that were in place. I've come to fulfill them. I'm not going to change it. I'm going to keep it the same, but it's going to be the fulfilled rather than removed. Now look what happens. Jesus is our high priest. It says in Hebrews 4, seeing then that we have a great high priest that is passed into the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Brothers and sisters, today we have a high priest, just like the Old Testament. Our high priest is today Jesus. We have a sanctuary, just like the Old Testament. Our sanctuary, however, is in heaven. We have sinners confessing, just like in the Old Testament. We have a sacrifice, just like in the Old Testament. This time, it's Jesus' death at the cross that testifies. We have the blood of the Lamb, just like in the Old Testament. We today have the blood of the Lamb. And I can continue. We have the same situation today in Israel as what Israel had. We have a high priest. We have a sanctuary. We have sinners. We have a sacrifice. What's changed? Something very important has changed. Let's look back into the sanctuary and see what has changed between the Old Testament and today. In other words, if you confess your sins today, where do the sins go? Say, for example, the theft of an axe from my neighbor. Exactly the same situation as in the Old Testament, right? If I as a sinner have stolen my neighbor's axe and I confess my sins, do they just disappear? What happens to them? Let's look into the sanctuary. Do you know that the Bible clearly explains that the record of sin is in heaven? Matthew 12 says to us that I say to you, every idle word, whatever men may speak, they shall give account of it in the day of judgment. Everything you've ever done, every idle word, I mean, if an idle word is kept record of, will not murder or theft or something like that, one of the sins be recorded in heaven? Yes, absolutely. And when we get to heaven, brothers and sisters, and in heaven at least, when the judgment is taking place and the law is the foundation, then the books will be opened and our records will be compared to the law. Let's read together Revelation 20 verse 12. I saw the dead, small and great, stand before God, and the books were opened. That's the books of sin. And another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged out of these things which are written in these books according to their works. So there are two systems of books. One book, one set of books that keeps the record of the sins, and another book which is called the book of life. This is the list of the sins and the names, at least, the names of those whose sins are covered by the blood of the Lamb. So where's our sin recorded? In heaven. Now look what happens. Let's go back to the sanctuary. Emmanuel, Jesus, God with us, is set up in the middle of Christianity and visible to all. Do any Christians not know about Jesus? No. Just like in the Old Testament, look at the graphic, just like in the Old Testament where the sanctuary was, the tabernacle of God was among men, so Jesus today is among his people, visible to all. The sinner's mind takes him into the most holy and he recognizes that he's broken the law. And because of that, he's subject to a death sentence. Please remember that a death sentence is a very serious penalty. It needs to be dealt with in a very serious and very structured way. The only way to be freed from the death sentence, which is the condemnation of the law, is for something else to die in the sinner's place. Doesn't